let's start the discussion. I have actually several questions, but I will start with the one question and then I will let the other ask. But my major question or major problem was that I was not convinced.
And this is good that David has a major problem. This is what I expect from David.
I have several major problems.
And this is why
I was not really convinced by your bold statement that there is disproportionate role of big organisms.
Disproportionate
role in energy flux or anything like it. The point is, okay, it is a little bit difficult for me to explain it, but the point is that let's assume the size distribution of trees in the forest.
Yes.
As far as I remember, in your earlier paper, you were basically claiming that all size classes have integrated, have the same role because there is something like energy equivalent. So this is first thing which kind of. Yeah.
So I know where this is going. So right.
Okay. And then you claim, and I know the statement and I believe it, that productivity can be predicted by the maximum size of the trees. Okay, but it does not mean that the biggest trees have a larger role than smaller trees, because the maximum size of the trees is just the indication or the parameter of the overall size distribution. So my point is that in some forests there are bigger trees, but it means that the distribution is kind of shifted. So even smaller trees are more abundant and the total productivity is higher. Yeah. So I do not see the argument why or where you come from when you are stating that the largest organisms have like major role.
So let me try to summarize then what
sure.
you're asking, just so I understand. But I think there were two questions in there.
Yeah.
The first is that there is a implicit assumption that as you go from the biggest individuals to the smallest individuals, say we're talking about a forest, that they're growing using resources at the same metabolic line.
Because the smaller the trees are, the more dense they are, the higher density.
The higher and the higher density that they are. That's right. And so an implicit assumption then is that the smallest individuals are not suppressed by the biggest ones, right? And so that there's no, the extreme version of that is that there's no light competition, and there's no.
Well, that's what
there's no. It's basically assuming kind of a symmetry then of competition instead of an asymmetrical competitive.
Well, that's what you state in the paper.
Yes. So yes, that is an implicit assumption. And I actually think that in general that is supported from the data. Now this is a whole other discussion that people are interested in. But I am not based on previous work and based on data that I've seen and analyzed, I think in general there's reasonable support for that assumption. And that mainly has to do with the fact that as you go from the big things to the small things, there are a lot of additional shifts and traits, leaf foliar traits, then that effectively compensate for the changes in light environments and changes in competitive
Okay, so it means that small individuals have in average or integrated in space the same role as large.
I think in general that's reasonable, but I understand the questioning then of that because that does question some other ecological theory understanding of light competition.
Yes, my question is, if this holds, how you can claim that larger individuals are more important?
You work through the math. So if you go then through the math, if you then calculate in each then in terms of the fraction then of the total then productivity then of the forest, then it's the largest individuals that are dominating.
May I have a related question? Could you show the maths where you made the integration from the smallest up to the largest?
Let's see if we can.
I was not sure I understood.
Okay. Well,
No. Where's previous light? But even this would do. Is there a pointer?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Here, this is a function of the body mass,
Right.
Which expresses the metabolic rate or something.
Yes.
Then this is the size distribution.
Yes.
Why there is not abundance?
Abundance is in the size
in the
distribution. That's a frequency distribution of individuals. Okay. So there's no species in this.
Okay. Well, I have no
Right.
problem with this.
So
just
it's a frequency
body-
distribution.
over body sizes, but
Yeah.
right. Then this comes back to David's question.
Yeah.
This is essentially the.
So from your previous paper, it follows that energy
Then one needs to
flows-
make assumptions on the B, then, which obviously are not very trivial.
Yeah. I assume that you predicted or assume that the flux which goes through trees is basically invariant in terms of size, because bigger trees are just rarer, right?
In terms of, yes, the total.
Okay, and you are saying now that the productivity is not proportional to the flux then?
No, that per size class, that is constant. Okay. But now as you whittle away, reduce then the size classes, you're then taking away then the productivity, right? Because the smallest ones do not compensate.
Sure, but that's another question.
So think of then kind of sizes going from the smallest then to the largest, and then yes, there is this within then the community, this energetic equivalence, so that the smallest ones,
Yeah.
because they're smaller, but there's more of them,
Yeah.
in a given size class, those small cohorts are producing biomass at about the same rate as the largest ones per
Okay.
unit area.
Okay, so then I'm
So then as you increase then the size range, you're adding then on to the total production, okay, or the total flux.
Of course, but it doesn't mean that the largest have the they just increase the total production, but they
That's
do
right.
not have higher role or more important role than the smallest one, because all the size classes have the same role. You just increase the range of them.
Right, and that's exactly what I'm saying. So then as you reduce then the range, if you then integrate then across then that flat distribution, then you get a reduction. Right? So
Yes,
you
of course,
take out
but it
the-
doesn't mean that the largest ones have disproportional role for energy fluxes. They just
When you analyze it on the community level, yeah, that's right, because you're just chopping off and size distributions. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. But in terms of if you want to predict the NPP,
Sure,
because
but that's-
of the allometry then that's involved,
Sure.
you have to take then if you have the largest individual, then there is a fractional power on it. So we're saying the same thing, David. There's no
Okay, but yours. Okay, so maybe I just didn't get your main statement that bigger organisms are more important. I didn't get the evidence for it, even for animals actually. They are good for measuring total productivity, but they
in a per unit then area because of the energy equivalence.
Yeah.
Yes, that is right. But if you want then maybe part of the confusion here is that if you want to then predict then
That's
the productivity, you take the largest individual,
course, because-
and then there's a fractional power.
Yes, of course, because larger individuals indicate that there are many individuals of
Right.
all sizes, and it is just a shifted distribution. But
I
it
think
doesn't
we're-
mean that they are more
I
important.
think we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and the,
Good,
yeah. Oh,
I
I'm
just
sorry.
wanted to ask that question about that gem simulation.
The GEM simulation. Yeah.
How would it be possible to verify the predictions experimentally?
In principle, yes. Has it been done? Not to my knowledge. What is nice then about the GEM approach is that all of those functions can be measured locally. And in principle, one can look at the abundances and the trophic structure and the size distribution. Have I done that? No. But in principle, one could.
To what detail does that simulation go as far as interactions between organisms?
There are, I don't have the slides here on this, but there are basic trophic interactions, these type 1, type 2, type 3 kind of functional responses. You can vary then those. You can vary competitive effects to various degrees if you really want to. It's not the most detailed model, okay, but it has like the basic knobs I would think that you would want to turn to begin to explore that complexity. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I perhaps will more or less continue in David's question. I understood that the large animals, large trees are excellent predictors for distribution of a number of, say, ecosystem variables and so on. But I also bit afraid that you used inversely that relation, like the explanation that if the maximum size of the largest animal is too small, so that it would necessarily cause the reduction in the say respective community variables, and I didn't understand how you infer the conclusions that with disappearance of large animals and large trees, the structure of community should be reduced, because you know that during quaternary climatic cycle there is a regular exchange in distribution of large animals or trees and so on. During glacial, the predatory pasture predatory assimilation pathways is regular, and which of course is correlated with the increased number of large herbivores and prey predators. But in interglacial it completely differs, because the community changed to a very complicated assemblage of very secondary consumers and a lot of insectivores and similar things, and the energetic assimilation is simply diffused and changed in the different way in which the role of large animals is quite reduced. That in the interglacial assemblages, vast majority. So
just so I understand, can I just summarize what the question? So what you're asking is that this approach does not include past climatic cycles that could potentially overwhelm or negate some of these relationships.
Yeah, and I was especially curious on the, say, mechanism or the causality which should lead to so large reduction in structure of communities as you predicted in your last slides.
Well, it's certainly true that to start with the simulation models, we wanted to take out additional complications having to do with natural climatic variability on the scale of centuries to more. So any Milankovitch cycling or forcing is not included in anything then that was simulated. And that was done on purpose, right? So we wanted to just explore the effect of removing the large things, ignoring kind of all of the other potential sources of variability. I agree with you that it could very well be that going back to, say, 100,000 years ago, if we put in natural climatic cycles, maybe that was working against these trends so that maybe all these results I showed you washed out. Maybe that wasn't the case. And so that's an open possibility, okay? And I think that's kind of like the next step to explore. So I think that's a very good point. What I would kind of offer then in return is that I think the importance of what we have done is to explicitly remove that effect and just ask what happens to the biosphere under simplistic assumptions to start, where we can actually gain tractability in addressing the question by removing the largest individuals. The next step is to add these additional complications as well. So I agree with you on that point.
I was going to ask you about that article on megafauna and the disappeared places in megafauna of Amazon, rainforest or grasslands in those times. The main point, maybe I didn't understand it. Main point was that loss of megafauna leads to the reduction of fertility of the ecosystems. But in the same time, I can turn it upside down, and I can say the loss of fertility leads to the loss of megafauna. And if I see the kind of the evolution of that place since the Pleistocene, it was in the past it used to be grasslands which accommodate humus, and all those megafauna species were oriented to the grass. So if you take some nowadays megafauna like horses, cows, zebus, goats, sheep, and nowadays indigenous groups, they try to do it through the rainforest.
Right.
They will not eat there anything, so they will die very quickly. I have seen indigenous cows in Peruvian Amazon, which are size of dogs almost, and very hungry. So it doesn't work.
The size of dogs, really, right?
Like this one.
All right. Okay.
I have seen in San Diego Zoo some cows from Celebes, which are very small, or from Bali, rainforest. So it doesn't work some way, or maybe I didn't understand the nature of the article.
So one thing that we, on purpose, did not touch or cover was the role of human domesticated animals. And, I mean, clearly that has to have an effect. And it's really unclear at this point what's the role of our commensals, all right, so cows, sheep, horses, and whatever, in terms of influencing a lot of these biospheric measures. So that's on purpose, because we want to just start, okay, with a more simplistic approach and then begin then to add these things as needed. So what I'm showing you here, this is a great comic. I don't know if you read XKCD, but they had this wonderful comic showing, so if each of these different boxes then represents a given number of land mammals. And so one box then equals about 1 million tons. And so they kind of colorized then, in terms of the total land mammals across the globe, what percentage then of them are wild, basically, left. And so the green then boxes, those are the wild animals based on these estimates. And everything that's left over in terms of the proportion of all the animals then on Earth, the land mammals, this is by far cattle, sheep, and the center here is humans. Right? So very clearly, the nature of mammals, has changed, right? And in terms of the proportion of energy flux going through wild to the domesticated as well as humans, that has dramatically changed as well. So all of the results I showed you are for this very small percentage of things that's left, right? Which leaves all of our commensals and ourselves in terms of the mammalian biomass and mammalian metabolism. So I think a really challenging kind of like next step is to begin to incorporate, all of this additional dynamic as well. And so your question brings up the point that I wanted to emphasize because I had this slide, that perhaps one of the bigger uncertainties is the role of ourselves as well as our commensals.
But Pleistocene animals were very much like nowadays cows or goats. They do not climb to trees, and obviously because they are so heavy, and they're oriented to the grass.
But also they're restricted. They're not roaming, as on the scale that the megafauna, once did. So with
just related thing. So do you think that in fact we have actually now more megafauna than any time period before?
That is, I have no idea, and I don't know.
Because it's possible.
It's entirely possible, especially because of all the energetic inputs then going then to their domestic part. So in terms of the total kind of like biospheric component, maybe all of that now is passing through or domesticated animals. Yes. I'm sorry, possible to Oh, kind of like other, insect colonies and kind of like all of, I think it would be, there's the estimate of, E.O. Wilson that, the ants then of the world, major dominators, in terms of, energy fluxes. I think it would be really good to work through all those different calculations in the light of this, to really begin to compare them. But outside of, some of that work by Wilson and a few others, I'm not really aware of much.
I'm sorry, did you ask whether this megafauna, like the biomass of megafauna, is comparable to biomass of, no?
No, I'm asking if the superorganisms, for example, insects or something, can be considered as megabiota.
Oh, I see.
Fitting into this theory.
I think so. I think it would be really good to really consider that. Yeah.
You mean the also megafauna? I was wondering if your findings would also be kept for different scales as well. So for smaller scales, your findings would be the same, and you also would expect the same pattern for latitudinal gradients. So if there is some force, for example, they would behave the same as the Antarctic or the tundra or different places in higher latitudes.
So the question is, have we explored this work at different spatial scales? The quick answer is no. Now, would differences in spatial resolution that influence the results? I don't think so. Because in general, if you're just dealing with forests, if you double the amount of area, you're doubling the amount of individuals then that you run into. So it's just a scalar. But if there's a maximum limit, say like a hydraulic limit of maximum size, then that will then remain constant independent of spatial scale. So I don't think that spatial scale would influence the overall results, in terms of conclusions, I should say. But it's a good question.
Gosh,
yeah.
I was thinking all the time, I maybe miss it, how the biomass is measured. So the biomass of ecosystem, does it include like dead food, that biomass of, like in a food, like most of the biomass are dead cells, so is it counted from your estimation?
So the question is, how then is biomass then estimated?
Yes.
So for in the case of animals,
cells, what is like the relationship, which is totally different.
Right.
If you increase biomass, maybe like amount of like metabolic cells, metabolizing cells is the same. It can be the dramatic effect you show, but it doesn't mean that it should affect like the total energy fluxes because they would be limited by, I don't know, light and nutrients and so on.
So the question is, and this mainly applies then to plants, because plant biomass is both living and dead. Okay, right. So in everything that I showed you, Raj, the forest biomass, that includes, that's everything above ground and below ground, but no litter, no dead branches or things on the ground. It's whatever is standing. And so I think my quick response is that, yes, of course, there's more living and dead material than within plants, but that dead material is actually functioning. That's very important for biomechanics. That it's functioning in terms of xylem, right? So it's all part of the plumbing and kind of component. So it's not just this inert stuff that's not doing anything. It's a critical functional component then of being that size, right?
It's functional for energy.
Well, it's supporting then all the living then mass that's doing then the energy flux. So yeah, I get that question repeatedly, and yes, that's a very important kind of component, but it doesn't impact any of the conclusions then that I told you, because that non-living component is an essential functional component then of plants. The same thing, I mean, we talk about mammal mass. A lot of that's bone, right? Sure, it's metabolizing, but it's not metabolizing very much. So should we take out the bone component and only look at the metabolizing tissue?
Sorry, but then it's figure out that like elephants has like some effect because they are doing disturbance. We don't question it. It's of course it's like simple, but if you argue that it should do something, it's like.
Well, that dead component, though, that's storing carbon. Okay, there's nutrients in there. I mean, it's it's a component of the body.
It's not connected to metabolic.
It is intrinsically connected because it is basically a vascular network, and the metabolism is proportional to the network. So because you need to provide water to the metabolism, so it goes through the trunk. So it is basically metabolic.
So what I would say is that, yes, it's not respiring, so those cells are not living, but they're functioning.
Yeah.
And their function is absolutely critical to the metabolism then of the living cells. And again, just like, I mean, when we do allometry, we don't quibble about the bone mass and taking that out. Because bones are functionally important, for biomechanics, right? So on. So I'm happy to talk more, but in terms of the components of the necromass, okay, that's an important functional component of the metabolism.
I agree with you actually that it is functioning, but the truth is that, for example, if people try to compare biomasses, this PNS paper where we read biomasses of different groups, of course trees will be much more important because their dead cells are much more important.
But remember, that's stored carbon, okay? That's locked up in a living individual. Okay? So it's functionally important. And it's also important in terms of governing the resource transport.
Yes, but stored carbon is also in peat bogs.
That's true, yeah.
So, and is it biomass? If you have 100 meters deep peat bog, there's argument from stored carbon is not, and basically you have also coal, right?
You have coal as well.
Yeah.
Actually, two really closely related questions, and I don't know much about it, so I'm really curious. Do you think that these rules or presumptions which you stated would work if you would include that large part of biodiversity and biomass out of the terrestrial vertebrates and
for insects and microbes.
For instance, because for instance, for me, I'm an entomologist, it's really hard to believe that the energetic flux is larger in, elephants than to termites, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but it would be absolutely great. As I think so. And the second question is really related, would it work in oceans where actually a really large proportion of biomass exists and very important part of the energetic flux are definitely planktonic animals and such stuff. Because these are this works for like terrestrial mammals or mammals generally and bees.
I mean, in principle, one can take the same approach, to these other groups, where unfortunately, we kind of historically have been lacking in data, but increasingly now we have better data sets. And some actually the better and earlier data sets on size distributions actually came, out of the oceans, looking at size distribution of plankton, looking at size distribution of fish, and so on. And I didn't. Just for reasons of just time, I didn't go into kind of aquatic organisms. But a lot of the size downgrading is also happening within the oceans. In fact, if anything, it's probably more dramatic in the oceans than it is on the terrestrial landscape, especially recently. And in principle,
you mean on fish, or you mean like generally?
Mainly in fish, because that's where our better historical data are in terms of reductions of sizes. But I agree, it would be really interesting to look to see, within terrestrial insects, microbes, other groups that, historically we haven't been able to monitor very well. But in principle, one can take the same approach.
My question was about your opinion. If you include like insects.
I'm sorry,
my question was about your opinion. Like,
my opinion.
If you include insects and bacteria, for instance, would still the larger species would be more crucial for like energetic fluxes and.
Yeah, this gets to David's question in terms of whether or not the largest individuals are more powerful versus then the large species, which you have large individuals and then a lot of different individuals, right? So that's kind of part of there may be some confusion in terms of how we're discussing that. So in terms of, these, if I step back, I've used the term energetic equivalence, which, that's a whole other thing we can debate and discuss. But that relates to calculating per unit area the total amount of metabolism or biomass based on the average metabolism or biomass per individual multiplied by the total number of individuals then of that size, right? So it could very well be that on a per unit area then basis, these very small things are fluxing very similar amounts then of energy. But in terms of the implications of reducing then size ranges, whenever you start then chopping off the largest sizes, reducing then their numbers then on back, the total amount then that's being fluxed or produced in that given trophic level or that given clade of interest then will decrease. So in principle, what I've told you here should
decrease with size.
As you then reduce then not only the big things, but the number then of these big things.
Yeah, but that's a different question. If you reduce it, what happens? But the question is that, like, okay, you mentioned it. First thing is in terms of species. You compare species of different size and what is their relative role. In this respect, at least for animals, I'm pretty sure that relative role in terms of energy flux per unit area is actually higher for bigger animals because energy equivalence doesn't hold. The slope of the density mass relationship is mostly shallower than 3/4, which means that the bigger animals have higher, bigger role. However, there are more species of small animals, and so if you integrate it across species, I'm not sure.
Well, someone needs to do it.
It's difficult actually because the data, but for species for sure, bigger species have higher role because it is not like the decrease of abundance is not completely compensated. Decrease of size is not completely compensated by increase of abundance, but integrated across species.
I think this was well visible on the plot with the birds. If you can show.
Yeah, sure. No, in birds it is clear that bigger birds have more bigger role. That's for sure. But there are much more small animals. Exactly. And this is something which is really difficult to say across
more calculations. Okay. Any other questions?
I was curious about one of the remarks that you made on the conclusion slide regarding diseases and parasites.
Yes.
Can you just briefly elaborate what can be the relationship between these things and disease and products?
Right. So the question is to elaborate on how diseases, pathogenesis, intersects them with what I told you today. So there's a very interesting literature out there having to do with how body size influences disease dynamics from individuals, that is looking at onset of various kind of landmarks of pathogenesis, that is timing until you see the first symptoms, timing until you die from like Ebola or rabies or something. And there's also how then body size then influences then the spread of diseases on landscapes, okay, which have to do with individuals dispersing across landscapes, interacting with other individuals, right? And so the thinking is that the metabolism then of an individual controls the rate of pathogenesis. That is, the timings then of different onsets then of disease, and then also timings of passing along the disease. So we've done some earlier work, and there's some other really cool papers out there now where they have looked at if you inoculate animals of different body sizes with effectively the same kind of disease, be that rabies or anthrax or something, and then ask how long does it take for that animal to show the onset then of a symptom, or how long does it take on average for that individual then to die if it's something really lethal like anthrax, right? As you go from a small mammal to a large one, is there a size signal? And of the diseases looked at, and I think now in the literature there have been maybe 6 or 7 looked at, ranging from some pretty nasty protozoa and viruses, and I think even a prion, that the timings of those events scale with body size. That is, bigger things take longer to get sick, and they take longer to die, but also during that time they're moving over a much wider than range. And it also, there's indication then that in terms of rates of evolution of pathogens, that rates of evolution then may be lower in larger body size than individuals. Now, a lot of this is really somewhat contentious, and there's a lacking of really good data, but that's some of the arguments then that are out there. I guess we're done, right? So, by taking out the biggest individuals, you're then also taking out that potential buffering effect on disease dynamics. So that in general, the thinking is that if you're having an ecosystem or a landscape dominated by smaller organisms, disease outbreaks are much more spiky and patchy and flashy in a way, rather than kind of smoothed out kind of dynamics. And because of which the thinking is that one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of emerging diseases, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but there could be this interaction then with loss of dominance then of large wild animals. Now there's this whole other thing with the importance of domestic animals as well in terms of disease dynamics, and so that is also likely complicating things. But it's an open question because I think there are reasonable data sets now to show that there should be this body size role in terms of the spread of diseases on landscapes and the timing of pathogenesis effects. And we just really haven't explored the implications of that.
I have one question related to fertilization, soil fertilization by big animals. Do we really have evidence that for example, in Amazonia, that the animals did it? I mean,
did it?
Yeah, that they really were able to, and they really
defecated. Yeah, they
well,
certainly defecated.
No. They defecated, but of course, the level of nutrients could be different in Pleistocene, let's say.
Oh,
general level, because the nutrients were not washed out. So the question is, what was the contribution to, of big animals to the overall fertility of the soils? Or you can reverse it. You can say, okay, they defecated, but when it is real rainforest, you know, the nutrients are very
washing out.
Yeah, exactly. So what was, is it like known? What is the contribution of big
I would go back to that 2013 Chris Dowdy paper. I think they do some speculation then on that. But I think in general, if you just look at the base rock that was there, I mean, the Andes have always, since the orogeny then of the Andes, they've always been this primary source then of nutrients. A relatively young rock, right? Sure. And the Amazon then historically has been relatively low, right? And so that you have immediately a big spatial difference in the concentration of nutrients.
I understand, but still I can imagine a situation when they go there, they defecate, but everything is washed out immediately by rain, and the real increment of fertility may be negligible. I don't know.
These are our first attempts to get at that question, and it wasn't until the 2013 Dowdy et al. Paper that I'd ever really seen kind of detailed quantitative attempts, then to estimate what then the magnitude of the effect was on diffusivity then of nutrients based on the loss of large, more free-roaming animals.
No, I would like to believe it.
Yeah.
In the response of the extinction of the megafauna, I was just wondering how much do you think that the extinction of big things, which also sometimes, a lot of times they hunt things that are more or less the same size, they would be important for the density-dependent effect on all the organisms as well that could counteract this loss. Let's suppose, for example, you lost wolves, and then you have a lot of pigs that would compensate the biomass of loss of wolves, and would have the same counter-response of the.
So the Mattingly model does include some density-dependent kind of effects, and that was one of the reasons why we were interested in the outputs of the Mattingly model, because we're interested in knowing whether or not the small things would compensate. Right? Now, I think we can go in and kind of detail, all right, well, what are the density-dependent effects, and do we believe those? Should others be included? And for example, there's no evolution, in model 2. So that's probably, another density-dependent effect that's not there. So to our first approximation, using the assumptions of the Mattingly model, that doesn't appear to be the case. That is, the small things are not compensating. There's a little bit of compensation for a few of those metrics, but it doesn't come close to compensating for the full effect.
I had a question that was bouncing in my mind because in Australia, in the continent, it's okay, megafauna has gone extinct like 40,000 years ago. So actually, we're using a comparative test with, similar ecosystems like the right system in South Africa.
Yeah.
But so, megafauna and another place where you've got
right. So the person to really talk to about that is Chris Dowdy. So he and Yadvinder Mali, they're going to regions that still have megafauna in Africa. So they have a lot of study plots in Africa. And they're actually looking at soil nutrients in areas with and without African megafauna and comparing it to other locations. So, and they're even trying to do experiments and things. And so I would keep an eye on some of Chris Dowdy's work. He's really interested in these questions. In fact, he recently had a paper looking at, this is a totally crazy paper, but I thought it was pretty ingenious. He was actually looking at nutrient composition of coal beds before and after big extinction events, the 65 million years big extinction events, and looking at coal deposits kind of before and after the extinction event. So effectively, you have another experiment where you're getting rid of megafauna, the dinosaurs, right? And so he was able then to track maximum body size ranges and median body size ranges kind of before and after. and then using the nutrient composition of coal as an indication then of the potential fertility then of vegetation. And it actually turns out that the coal companies, that's what they measure, right? They're really concerned about the quality of coal, so there's all this nutrient data. And so Chris looked spatially at nutrient data across all these different coal beds before and after the extinction. And he actually found pretty good evidence, anyways, to suggest very similar results, that the reduction of the big dinosaurs, in particular herbivorous dinosaurs, actually led to a dramatic decrease in terms of the nutrient composition within coal. Now, is that a strong test? I don't know. It's at least consistent. I mean, there's all these other things that could be happening, you know, after a big meteorite, you know, hits the planet that could influence nutrient composition of coal beds. But that's just one crazy example of some of Chris's work, and he is doing. So he has several papers looking at this, and so I would check out his stuff.
Okay. No other questions? Perfect. We can go for a beer. So thank you very much.